el Yeshua sim. Eftach velo yevcha. Yizi vezimras yadainam. Vayhi li shua ushavtem mayim bisason. Mimahene ha-Yeshua Ladoinoi ha-Yeshua Alamcha Birchosecha Sela Adoinoi Sivaisi Mahanu Miskav Lanu Elohei Yaakov Selam Adonai Sivaoi Sashrei Adam Botei Agba Hoshia Melech Yaneinu B'Yom Koreinu. Hello everybody! A good Vach Shavua Tov, a good week to you. Let's start the week off right by learning chapter 9 of Tractate Nazir, the 17th volume of the Talmud. Our daf is Samech Aleph, page 61. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Saturday night? Jay Yitzhak in saying Shavua Tov from Minnesota, Melissa in Great Neck, New York, Lucy in Minnesota, Belle in Texas. Mickey Stein, Shavua Tov. I hope you had a wonderful, restful Shabbos. Wonderful to catch you live. Amen. Great to have you with us. Paul in the Great Northwest. Mickey's asking, Michael Stein is asking, is my Beshert here tonight? Who knows? Could be. Is she out there? Peggy in Colorado. Vic wishing a Shavua Tov from Rhode Island. Paul in the great suburbs of Chicago. Sharon just returned from the bar mitzvah of one of her students. Charlie in North Carolina. Over on the YouTube side. Lynn in North Texas. Marjorie in Georgia. Aoife in checking out and wishing, hoping everyone had a restful Shabbos. Welcome everybody. Very interesting daf tonight. Although I've been kicking myself a little that I say sometimes at the beginning of the show, this daf is interesting, this daf is challenging, this daf, going to be a little bit meditative. Who's to say? Why am I making a judgment like that? I'm just telling a story. It's probably inappropriate. Every daf is important. Every daf is a challenge. Every daf has multiple levels. And if at first blush it doesn't look, fascinating and engrossing, it's just because we have to dig a little deeper and understand what's going on. But at any rate, chapter 9, here in Tractate Nazir, page 61, Mishna number 1. Gentiles, non-Jews, do not have Nazirus, right? So this whole concept of taking the vow of Nazirus, which, as I've mentioned over and over again, is not possible when the temple is not standing. Perhaps it will be possible again when Mashiach comes and the third temple goes up. But we don't have Nazirus now and haven't since the second temple was destroyed nearly 2,000 years ago, because the Nazir, at the conclusion of his term, has to bring offerings. Even when we had it, the sages discouraged it because it was unnecessary. It was a voluntary vow. No one is making you do it. And when you undertake Nazirus, so now you've taken something that is permitted and even something we rejoice in, the produce of the grapevine. So wine, which we use to make Kiddush, to sanctify Shabbos or a holiday, now becomes prohibited to the Nazir. Plus, there's so many rules are involved with it, as we've been seeing. You could easily run afoul of them and come to make a transgression that you would not have made if you had not undertaken that vow in the first place. So, at any rate, the concept of Nazirus is something that does not apply to non-Jews. A non-Jew can take vows or do whatever he wants, but it's not going to be under the rubric of Torah law. And he wouldn't be able to bring the offerings that a Jew can bring in the temple when the temple is standing at the conclusion of Nazirus. So, Gentiles do not have Nazirus. The laws of Nazirus do not apply to non-Jews. They are not subject to the prohibitions of a Nazir, nor does one accept their offerings at the end of Nazirus. However, women and Canaanite slaves, right, so meaning slaves that were owned by Jews when slavery existed in the ancient world, even though they were non-Jews, do have Nazirus. Why are women mentioned here? You'll see in a moment, but basically women and slaves often had similar halachic obligations that were different from the obligations of men, right? So for example, man is obligated in tefillin, women are not, right? Because why? These are time-bound positive commandments. Time-bound meaning there's a certain time every day when you're supposed to do that. Why are women exempt from that, right? It's not that they're being discriminated against, it's that it's a realistic leniency for women, given that especially in the ancient world, the woman was the primary caregiver of the children and the man the primary breadwinner. What did that mean? That women didn't have control of their time in the same way that men did, in the sense that the children could have needs at any time. So why would slaves, slaves owned by Jews, right? Because slaves outside of the Jewish world are not being referred to here, right? They're talking about when slaves were owned. They didn't have control of their time either. So even though, interestingly, a non-Jew who became a slave of a Jewish family would suddenly become obligated in many Jewish obligations, even though they had not become Jews, and they would have similar obligations that women had. And in fact, sometimes when people came out of that enslavement, they wanted to be Jewish because they had experienced life as a Jew during that period. That's a topic for another day, but here the Mishnah is telling us that non-Jews do not have Nazirus, but women and non-Jewish slaves of Jewish owners do have Nazirus. We don't have slavery and haven't in thousands of years, but when it existed. So the Mishnah adds, there is a greater stringency in the case of women than in the case of slaves, as a master may force his slave to drink wine, shave his hair, or become ritually impure from a corpse, despite the slave's vow of Nazir. So interesting that the slave could have such a vow even though he didn't have control over himself, and therefore the master could override the prohibitions of Nazirus. However, a husband or a father cannot override the prohibitions of Nazirus for his wife or daughter. Gemara. The Mishnah teaches that non-Jews do not have Nazirus, whereas women and slaves can be Nazirim. And the Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? It is as the sages taught that at the beginning of the passage about Nazirus, which states, speak to the children of Israel, that's Numbers 6:2, right? So the laws of Nazirus are introduced with the introduction, speak to the children of Israel and say, meaning this is a law for the children of Israel, not for people who are not the children of Israel. And this serves to emphasize that these laws apply to Jews, but not to Gentiles. Furthermore, the continuation of the verse, and say to them, when a man or woman shall clearly utter a vow, this serves to include slaves. And the Gemara asks, why do I need a verse to include slaves? Haven't you said the following principle? Any commandment that a woman is obligated in its performance, a slave is also obligated in its performance. Since the laws of Nazirus apply to a woman, they should likewise apply to slaves. Why do you need a special verse to repeat this principle that we have generally established? And Rava said, here it is different, as with regard to vows, the verse states to bind his soul with a bond. Numbers chapter 30, verse 3. And the sages expounded that this is referring only to one whose soul is in his possession, i.e., a person who is under his own jurisdiction. And this excludes a slave whose soul is not in his possession, but who is under his master's control. So the verse from Leviticus is necessary lest you say that since a slave's soul is not in his own possession, one should say that with regard to the laws of a Nazir as well, he cannot undertake this vow, notwithstanding the principle that slaves have similar laws to women with regard to obligations obligations who can become Nazirim. And the aforementioned verse teaches us that a slave can, in fact, take a vow of Nazirus. Now, remember when we're talking here about slavery in the Bible, it's slavery under the rubric of Torah law. There's obviously, been slavery, that, horrific institution in many places and times throughout the world and throughout history. But when you're talking about Jews owning slaves under Torah law, it was actually like some kind of tremendous innovation in world history that slaves had certain rights. Slavery was just everywhere in the world. It was a fact of life in the ancient world. And slaves had no rights at all. I think in most places you couldn't even commit murder if you killed your own slave. But under Torah law, that changed, so something worth remembering. So the Gemara returns to the earlier exposition of the verse. And the master said in the Baraisa that the verse specifies, speak to the children of Israel, meaning which excludes the Gentiles. And the Gemara asks, and anywhere that Israel is written, are Gentiles not included in that verse? Are we saying that any time a law is introduced with speak to the children of Israel and say that whatever follows does not apply to non-Jews? If that's the principle, now the Gemara will bring a challenge to that and say, wait a minute, but there is a counterexample in the verse written with regard to the laws of valuations. As it is written, speak to the children of Israel. That's at Leviticus 27:2. This body of law, the valuation body of law, is introduced with that phrase, and it was taught in a Baraisa that the children of Israel can take a valuation vow, but Gentiles cannot take a valuation vow. If a Gentile declares, I undertake to donate the value of so-and-so, his vow does not take effect. Now, before I go on, so that sounds like, well, it's proving the point, right? That if it says something is for the children of Israel, it doesn't apply to Gentiles, and it just said, okay, so Gentiles don't take valuation vows. You might be wondering, what is a valuation vow? So valuation, or also called erech, or erech vows, and we'll learn more about that when we reach Tractate Arechin, is about this idea that one might take a vow to make a free will donation to the upkeep of the Holy Temple when it's standing. And how much is he going to vow? He could just say, I will donate. Right now I'm speaking just for teaching examples, so bli neder, I'm not making a vow. But a person could say in that context, I vow that I will, donate $100, or I will donate $1 million. And then he's taken a vow and he's going to be held to his vow. But what he might also do, and it's interesting that the Torah specifies this, is he might undertake to vow the value of a person. Now, in other matters, for instance, when we're talking about a wrongful death suit under Torah law, what is going to be the valuation of a person for those kinds of matters? And you might actually use like what kind of price that person would bring if they were sold as a slave. And a Jew could become a slave under Torah law. And that would happen, for example, if somebody was a thief and couldn't pay back what he stole, and he would then be turned over, made into a slave so that he could pay back his debt. And then if he was sold from one master to another, so then you could have a valuation of a slave. But erech vows are not based on that. Erech vows are just based on age and gender, and the Torah even specifies the value that depending on, how old you are and what gender you are, there's a value. And it's not your value on the slave market. It's obviously not, how can you ever value a human being? It's almost like it's impossible. But for this purpose, just to say, I will donate my erech value as a donation to the temple, that's what valuation means. That's the kind of body of law that we're talking about here. That body of law is introduced in the Torah with speak to the children of Israel. So the Baraisa continues, one might have thought that this means that Gentiles cannot be the subject of a valuation. A Gentile can't say, I vow to donate my erech value. That law doesn't apply to them. However, one might have thought that this means the Gentiles cannot be the subject of a valuation either. For example, if a Jew says, I hereby obligate myself to give the value of such and such a person who is a Gentile, this vow would not take effect. You might think that. Therefore, the verse states the inclusive expression, when a man shall clearly utter a vow of persons to the Lord according to your valuation, to teach that in this regard, every man, even a Gentile, is included in the laws of valuations. Inasmuch as the Torah also states with regard to a Nazir, when a man or woman shall clearly utter a vow, the vow of a Nazir, perhaps one should include Gentiles in the laws of Nazirus as well. Right? So if you take a Eric vow, you can say, I hereby obligate myself to give my own value. Or you could say, I will give the value of such and such a person. And then just based on their age and gender, there would be a number for that. And that person could be a Gentile or not. Gentiles can't take those vows, but a Gentile can be the subject of such a vow in terms of vowing to give that much money as charity. So the Gemara answers, so since we can, include Gentiles somewhat in the law of valuations, maybe we should include Gentiles at least somewhat in the law of Nazirus, even though this body of law is introduced in the Torah with speak to the children of Israel and say. So the Gemara answers, here in the case of Nazirus, it is different. As the verse states, for his mother, or for his father, or for his mother, for his brother, or for his sister, he shall not defile himself. Numbers 6-7. As we've said over and over, when you're a Nazir, you are not permitted to become impure for the dead. Meaning, you cannot enter a cemetery to attend the funeral, even of your father, even of your mother, even of your brother, or your sister. How is that relevant to this? From here it is derived that this mitzvah applies only to one who has a father, and this excludes a Gentile who does not have a father. What? What do you mean a Gentile doesn't have a father? Obviously people have parents, whether they're Jewish or not, but this is a legal definition. What do they mean by this? And the Gemara asks, with regard to what law does a Gentile lack a father? Obviously he has a father. What are you saying in this legal context? If we say it is with regard to inheritance law, but didn't Rabbi Chiya bar Avin say that Rabbi Yochanan said a Gentile inherits the estate of his father, not only according to the laws that Gentiles are bound to in whatever nation they live in, but also by Torah law. Even by Torah law, a Gentile inherits the inheritance of his father. Right? A Gentile inherits the estate of his father by Torah law, as it is stated, because I have given Mount Seir to Esau as an inheritance, to Esau, right? Jacob's brother, because it says in the Torah that Jacob's brother Esau had his own inheritance, right? The whole land surrounding Mount Seir. And Esau, or Asaph, is understood to be the progenitor of Rome. Right? So, Jacob is sort of like, with his grandfather Abram and his father Isaac, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're like the fathers of the Jewish people. Asaph is like the father of the whole West, right? Like Rome, which is understood to eventually mean Europe, America. Right? So Asaph got quite an inheritance. So obviously he can inherit from his father. So rather, this mitzvah of Nazirus applies to one who is warned concerning the honor of his father. And as the mitzvah to honor one's father, right? How do you honor your father? There are many things that you do to fulfill the fifth commandment, right, of the 10 commandments, honor your father and your mother. And that means a lot of different things, that you have to take care of them, you have to be good to them, you cannot hit them, you cannot speak harshly to your parents. There are many behaviors that are included in honor your parents. Now, the 10 commandments, there are many non-Jews who subscribe to the 10 commandments, but by Torah law, the 10 commandments do not apply to non-Jews. And we see that right away when you see that that you shall keep the Sabbath day. Shabbos is not a law that obligates non-Jews. Under Torah law, there's only 7 laws that obligate all of humanity, known as the Noahide laws. And actually, honor your parents is not one of those 7 laws. So they are not bound to honor the parents under the 10 commandments by Torah law. So what is it? So rather, the verse states with regard to a Nazir, for his father, for his mother, for his brother, for his sister, he shall not defile himself. and it should be understood as referring to one who has the potential to become ritually impure, which excludes a Gentile who has no potential to become ritually impure. Tameh. Right, we've been talking over and over again that if you become impure for the dead because you enter a cemetery, so then you have to go through the purification of one who is impure for the dead before you could enter the grounds of the temple to bring an offering. You'd have to go through that 7-day purification. Or if you come into contact with a dead creeping thing, or if you contract the skin condition psoriasis, or if you come into contact with objects that are ritually impure, that are tameh. So you will become tameh. If a woman is having her menses, or if a man comes into contact with a woman who's having her menses, you become tameh. You cannot eat consecrated food. You cannot enter the temple. That whole body of law does not apply to non-Jews. Non-Jews are pure. Right? They are always tahor. They do not become tameh. The concept of being ritually impure is a body of Torah law that only applies to Jews. Doesn't apply to non-Jews. A Gentile is not rendered impure even if he touches a corpse. An individual of this kind, therefore, cannot become a Nazir because the laws of Nazirus say you shall not become impure for the dead. So this can only apply to somebody who has the possibility of becoming impure for the dead. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive that Gentiles do not have the ability to become ritually impure? It is, as the verse states, with regard to one, and we're on 61b, by the way, with regard to one who enters the temple in a state of impurity, but the man who shall be impure and shall not purify himself, that soul shall be cut off from the midst of the assembly. This indicates that the laws of ritual impurity, of Tumah, apply only to one who has membership in the assembly of the Jewish people and excludes this non-Jew who is not a member of the assembly, i.e. he is not part of the Jewish people. Now, by the way, any non-Jew can become a Jew. You can make a conversion. You can go through the process and become educated and understand what mitzvahs you will be bound by when you become a Jew. And then once you do that full conversion, then you're a Jew in every sense of the word. And other Jews are not allowed to remind you that you were once a non-Jew. That's actually a big transgression. So anyone can become a Jew, but until you do not have the possibility of becoming ritually impure. The Gemara asks, and from where is it derived that this verse teaches that ritual impurity does not apply to non-Jews at all? Perhaps the verse is referring merely to some matters, maybe only some matters of ritual impurity of Tumah don't apply to non-Jews, but others do. So that's it. Now the Gemara is exploring that. So perhaps the verse is referring merely to charis, excision from the world to come, that you would lose your place in the world to come. In other words, it is teaching that he is not liable to receive charis for entering the temple while tameh, but perhaps a Gentile does have the possibility of becoming tameh. He's not going to receive charis if he's tameh and enters the temple like Jews would, but maybe he actually does become tameh if he touches a corpse. And the Gemara answers that the previous verse states, and the pure person shall sprinkle upon the impure. And this indicates that one who comes into contact with a corpse, before he can enter the temple, he has to go through that 7-day purification, which includes on the 3rd and 7th days, you are sprinkled with the waters of purification, waters that contain the ashes of the red heifer. There's only been 9 in all of Jewish history, like a pure red cow that was, sacrificed, that was slaughtered in a very special way, and then burned, ashes mixed with the water, and then you'd have to be sprinkled with that water on the 3rd and 7th day if you came into contact with the dead before you could enter the temple. And about that process, that procedure, it says, and the pure person shall sprinkle upon the impure. And this indicates that anyone who has the possibility of attaining ritual purity by means of the waters of purification also has the potential for ritual impurity. Anyone who does not have the possibility of attaining purity by means of the waters of purification does not have the potential for impurity either. And the Gemara asks, but one can say that it is only purity by means of the waters of purification that he does not have, meaning the non-Jew, that we don't sprinkle non-Jews with the waters of purification, but he does have the potential to be impure. And the Gemara answers, it is for this reason that the verse states, but the man who shall be impure and shall not purify himself, he shall be cut off from his people, to teach that these two statuses are interdependent. One who cannot be purified by the waters of purification cannot become impure in the first place. Right? So non-Jews cannot become tameh, cannot become impure. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said a different reason why a Gentile cannot become a Nazir, despite the fact that the term man in that verse does include Gentiles in the case of valuations, about erech vows. Here, with regard to Nazirus, it is different, as the verse prohibits a Nazir from becoming impure for his father and mother. And the prohibition is not relevant for Gentiles because the verse states, and you shall make them an inheritance for your children after you, Leviticus 25:46. And this verse establishes a child as one to whom a person can bequeath his slaves. The subject of this verse, that verse is about slaves that can be inherited, right? That a father can bequeath his slaves to his son. Again, hasn't been possible in thousands of years. But when it was, a slave was part of an inheritance. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov explains, this verse teaches that anyone who has inheritance, i.e. has the ability to bequeath his slaves to his children, also has the status of a father with regard to impurity, meaning that you will become impure for your father, which a Nazir is not permitted to do. And the verse prohibiting a Nazir from becoming impure to bury his father can only be addressing one who has this possibility. But anyone who does not have inheritance does not have the status of a father with regard to this kind of impurity. Since a Gentile cannot bequeath slaves to his child, see Gittin 38a, the status of a father with regard to impurity also does not apply to him. Consequently, the verse prohibiting a Nazir from becoming impure to bury his father cannot be addressing him. And the Gemara asks, if so, slaves should also not be included in the laws of ritual impurity of Nazir or Nazirus, as they too cannot bequeath slaves to their children. So, right, slaves cannot bequeath slaves. Slaves could own slaves, but cannot bequeath the slaves. So rather, Rava said a different reason why a Gentile cannot become a Nazir, even though he is included in the law of valuations, and despite the fact that the term man appears in both passages, granted with regard to erech vows, valuations, as it is stated, speak to the children of Israel, one can derive that the children of Israel can take a valuation vow, but Gentiles cannot take a valuation vow. One might have thought that Gentiles cannot be valuated either, therefore the verse states man, so as to include a Gentile in only one aspect of the laws of valuations, i.e. that a Gentile can be the subject of a valuation vow. And this does not negate the derivation from the children of Israel that Gentiles are generally excluded. So Rava continues his explanation. However, here, in the case of Nazirus, there is no possibility of interpreting the word man to include a non-Jew in only one aspect of the laws of Nazirus. Right? You might have thought that you can't generally apply the laws of Nazirus to Gentiles, but perhaps just like Gentiles can be subject to a piece of the law of valuations, maybe they can be subject to a piece of the law of Nazirus. From the phrase the children of Israel derived that the children of Israel can both take a vow of Nazirus and bring the Nazirus offering, if he became impure for the dead while a Nazir, or if he concluded his Nazirus in purity and he brings the final offerings, right? So only a Jew can bring those offerings. But Gentiles cannot both take a vow of Nazirus and bring the offerings of Nazirus. So one might have thought that Gentiles cannot be Nazirim at all. Therefore, the verse states man, which includes Gentiles in one aspect of the laws of Nazirus, i.e. that they can become Nazirim, they just can't bring the offerings. But that would be a terrible status to have, because then you could never leave Nazirus, right? If you could be included in Nazirus, then if you were to follow the law and you made a vow of Nazirus, you would be forever. So Rava continues his explanation. However, to prevent this, the sages would say, in response to this suggestion, if the phrase, the children of Israel, I'm almost done, by the way, if you have comments or questions, get them in. If the phrase, the children of Israel, is written due to the need to exclude a Gentile from bringing a Nazirus offering, one does not need to derive this law from here, and this is because it is already derived from there. As a Baraisa teaches that the verse, any man from the house of Israel, or of the strangers in Israel, who sacrifices his offering, whether it be any of their vows or any of their gift offerings, which are sacrificed to the Lord as a burnt offering, excludes a non-Jew from the offering of Nazirus. And this is the statement of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili. Note, it's that Gentiles are excluded from bringing the offerings of Nazirus. There were offerings, there were korbanos that a non-Jew could bring to the Holy Temple. They could bring a burnt offering. They could bring an elevation offering to the temple. So non-Jews were not excluded from bringing offerings to the Holy Temple that would go up as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. What they were excluded from is taking the vow of Nazirus and then bringing the offerings of Nazirus. Now the Gemara asks, but it can still be argued that the children of Israel is excluding the non-Jew from only some aspects of Nazirus, as one can say that this phrase teaches that the children of Israel can take a vow of permanent Nazirus, but Gentiles cannot take a vow of permanent Nazirus. And one might have thought that Gentiles cannot be Nazirim at all. And the verse therefore states man to teach that they can become Nazirim. The Gemara answers, Rabbi Yochanan said, is it written a permanent Nazir? The verse does not specify a particular type of Nazirus, therefore it excludes Gentiles from all types of Nazirus. Gemara offers yet another suggestion, but it could still be argued that the children of Israel is excluding a Gentile from only some aspects of Nazirus, as one can say that this phrase teaches that the children of Israel can vow that their minor sons be Nazirim, but Gentiles cannot vow that their minor sons can be Nazirim. And one might have thought that Gentiles cannot be Nazirim at all. And the verse therefore states man to teach that they can become Nazirim. And the Gemara answers, no, this argument does not work. Didn't Rabbi Yochanan say that the fact that a father can take a vow that his minor son will be a Nazir is a law transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai with regard to Nazirim? Since this law is not stated in the Torah, it cannot be excluded by a verse. So just one more suggestion and then we're done. That the Gemara is trying one more counter argument that maybe there's some aspect of Nazirus that a Gentile can undertake. So it could still be argued that children of Israel is excluding a Gentile from only some aspects of Nazirus, as one can say that the phrase teaches the children of Israel can shave and cut their hair by means of the offerings of their father's Nazirus. But Gentiles cannot shave and cut their hair by the means of their father's Nazirus offerings. In other words, if the father of a Nazir, who was himself a Nazir, died after having separated his Nazirus offerings, the son is able to bring those offerings at the close of his own Nazirus. One might have thought that Gentiles cannot be Nazirim at all. So the verse therefore states man to teach that they can become Nazirim, but they're just not included in that. And the Gemara answers, wasn't it stated that Rabbi Yochanan said that the law that a son may use his father's Nazir's offerings is a law transmitted to Moses at Sinai with regard to a Nazir? Since this law does not appear in the Torah, our verse, including the word man, cannot be coming to exclude it. So that finishes the counter-argument possibilities, and the bottom line, as the Mishna said, there is no Nazirus for non-Jews. Okay, let's check comments or questions on Nazir 61. J. Yitzhak, what would have been a practical reason to take the vow of a Nazir? I mean, it's a great question, right? We keep hearing the problems with doing it. One suggestion was made the other night. Well, you might do it just because you want to be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Nazirus, right? That it's a mitzvah that's in the commandment. It's not a commandment to become a Nazir, but once you take that vow to be a Nazir, so then there are certain mitzvahs that you can fulfill that only a Nazir can fulfill. So maybe just for the opportunity to, perform those mitzvahs, to not shave while a Nazir, to not drink wine while you're a Nazir, to not become tameh for the dead while you're a Nazir, and then to bring the offerings at the conclusion of Nazirus, and to shave at the end of Nazirus, just to be able to perform those mitzvahs. Somebody might have wanted to be a Nazir. Also, you could say, Rambam Maimonides teaches that how do we fulfill the commandment, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, etc. You shall love the Lord your God. Now, by the way, I always say that that's an incredibly important commandment, to love the Lord your God. And if you love your wife, you would tell your wife you love her. If you love your husband, you would tell him you love him. If you love your children, you tell your children, I love you. So if you're commanded to love God, one wonderful way to stimulate love of God is to say, I love you, God. Say it out loud with your lips, often, regularly. You know, it's great to be thankful to God. We should do that all day long, every day. In addition, we should say, I love you. You're so good to me. Thank you so much. I can't believe so many good things you've done for me, and you're so great, and you create such a beautiful world, and you take care of so many people. I love you. You know, it's a beautiful way to stimulate love. Maimonides says another way to stimulate love of the Creator is to learn, is to study, is to learn better, more about God. We can never fully comprehend God. It's impossible for us. But the more we learn about God and God's Torah and God's commandments, the more we'll start to appreciate how amazing God is, and the more that will stimulate love. And so one might think that perhaps, you know, and then one who comes to love God will want to do more for God all the time, and kind of like just direct his whole life to being, as God-loving and God-fearing and God-appreciating as possible. And that might be one reason that somebody might want to go that extra distance and become a Nazir. But the sages discourage it because it's so fraught with problems. Jay, if a slave dies that has children, what would become of the status of the children? I'm just mentioning a few principles here in passing. I haven't studied this. We will learn more about the laws of slavery. Just generally speaking, a Jew could become a slave, but that would not be a permanent slavery, right? It would be like 6 years of enslavement, and then he would go out. And when he goes out, you don't send him out empty-handed. It's very interesting, right, that a Jew who was a thief could then become enslaved to pay his debt. And what would happen to him? He would then be a slave of a Jewish family, and that Jewish family would have to take care of him. Like, he'd do work for them, but they would have to provide a pillow and a bed and food equal to what they had for themselves. And hopefully this person, who somehow his values got completely, cockeyed, so that he would become a thief, now would be, in the company of people who had better values, and, it would be a time of rehabilitation. We also have measures in the Torah that if a Jew who was a slave then wanted to stay a slave, it was better for him living in his master's house than on his own, then he could become a permanent slave, of his own volition, and people would actually do that because, being a slave to a kind family was maybe not so bad. But then with regard to non-Jewish slaves, Canaanite slaves owned by Jews, so then there's, very particular commandments about them. So we see that somebody, could own a slave, and for whatever reason, was still not able to pay a debt and became a slave. And then we have this situation that you're describing, but I have no idea, what sort of further principles and laws apply to that. We'll encounter that later in our Talmud journey. Sharon, were non-Jews actually clamoring to be Nazirim? I'm sure they were not. As so many times, we have questions brought up that, are not necessarily practical real world questions, but they were just saying, if a non-Jew wanted to be a Nazir, what would be the law? Maybe one time it happened. Okay, so then the question was asked and they started debating it and they figured out what the law. But I can't imagine there were so many, clamoring to be Nazir. Paul, any situation where a non-Jew might make a Jew impure. Example, what if a non-Jew asks his friend to be a pallbearer? And you could certainly do that. There's not any restriction why you can't do that. But then, you in that situation, you could say yes or you could say no when asked that. But then you would have come into contact with the corpse. You entered the cemetery, so if you were a Nazir, you would do something that's not permitted. And if you're just, not a Nazir, you can become impure for the dead. It's not prohibited to become impure for the dead. In fact, it's laudable right? It's an admirable and wonderful thing to do, to help in a funeral, right? And to attend a funeral, to be of help, to bury the unattended corpse. Even a Kohen Gadol, the high priest, is obligated to bury the unattended corpse, even though he's not allowed to become tamei, even to bury his own father. So there's nothing wrong with becoming tamei for the dead. It's just that you then have to go through the purification ritual before you enter the temple. And finally, Peggy, weren't slaves under the protection of their owners? Yes. Weren't they and their family taken care of? Yes. You know, it's just like a different concept of what slavery had been in the world before those laws came. So there you go. It's funny, I just saw this just a short video of Bill Maher, talking about how, with regards to slavery and all kinds of, just racism and sexism and all kinds of values that we've sort of, as a society, come to understand so much better what our obligations as humans are to each other. And so we judge people from history as if we would never have behaved like them, and he said, well, no, we're humans, and in every society, if we were living 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, we'd probably be average people with average values of whatever societies had back then. But it's good to remember that when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, it was just, it could only come from God, because it just brought a set of values into the world that just had not existed like that at all. There were some similar laws. There were codes. It's not like there was just an absolute immoral, lawless world. But there were so many laws that were included in the Torah that were absolutely revolutionary. And, the Torah was given to this small, tiny people that remained a small, tiny people so many thousands of years ago. And look at the impact of the Ten Commandments and so many Jewish values that have just become world values, right? Just human values that were revealed on Mount Sinai at that event. That's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday, at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Shavua Tov, good vach, have a great week. And Passover is around the corner, just around the corner. I think it's a week from Wednesday is the first Seder. So for everybody, may you have a kosher Pesach. Just one final note. We wish each other, that what we would say a Freilichen Purim, right? A happy Purim. But we wish each other a kosher Pesach, a kosher Pesach. It's very hard to have a kosher Pesach because it means you cleaned all the chametz out of your house. You got everything out of the house. But it also means that you're wishing each other health, right? Because if you're allowed to eat chametz, right? Things derived of like bread products that would normally be prohibited on Passover, if your health requires it. So when you say to somebody, have a kosher Pesach, you're saying to them, may you be healthy. It's a nice thought. I heard that from Mark Mandelbaum here. Good luck.